Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Library Author Talks event featuring Pamela Paul. My name is Terry Kirshner, and I'm the Executive Director of the Westchester Library System, a co-host of this event, along with the Westchester Library Association and book YaYa. I also want to acknowledge and thank our corporate sponsor, TD Bank. Now, I have no doubt that you're actually ready for the show to begin, so I will actually tell you a little bit about tonight's moderator, Delane Michel, who along with her husband, Dan Freed, created and run book YaYa. Raised in a South Louisiana literary family that includes her first cousin, Andre Debus III, and second cousin, James Lee Burke, Delane Michel has spent over 2 decades in the literary world, producing an acclaimed reading series, empowering marginalized voices, and writing fiction and nonfiction. Her career telling stories began with her work as an actor in theater, television, and feature films. In 1996, Ms. Michel created the critically acclaimed reading series, Spoken Interludes, to sold-out audiences that continue today. She then developed, taught in, and continues to run outreach writing programs for at-risk youth in inner-city schools, juvenile institutions, and prisons in New York and Los Angeles. The first story Ms. Michel wrote won the Thomas Wolfe Short Fiction Award. Her nonfiction work has been featured on NPR and in print media, and her first 2 novels were published by HarperCollins. She is currently working on a memoir. So it is my pleasure to present Delane Michel.
Thank you so much, Terry. I am so honored to be here tonight with Westchester Library Association and Westchester Library System, and particularly with Pamela Paul, who is gracing us with her beautiful new book, Rectangle Time, her first children's book. And what makes it even more special is it's not being published until February 16th. So we're getting the peak, which is really, really lovely of her. As you might know, Pamela lives here in Westchester, so she's a local. And a little later in the program, I'm going to let her tell you a story about her very early connection to libraries in her life, which is why we thought she would be the perfect person to have this event with us. And Pamela being Pamela, she was amazing and said yes. So Pamela Paul is the editor of the New York Times Book Review and oversees all book coverage at the New York Times, which she joined in 2011 as children's book editor. She is also the host of the weekly book review podcast for the Times. She's the author and editor of 6 books: How to Raise a Reader with Maria Russo, My Life with Bob, Flawed Heroine Keeps Book of Books, Plot Ensues, The Starter Marriage and the Future of Matrimony, Pornified, Parenting Inc., and By the Book, Writers on Literature and the Literary Life. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Vogue. She is a former contributor to Time, a former correspondent for The Economist, and has been a columnist for the style section of the Times, The Economist, and Worth magazine. Her new book, Rectangle Time, a picture book for children, will be published on February 16th by Philemon Penguin Books for Young Readers. Her next book for adults, 100 Things We've Lost to the Internet, is forthcoming in the fall by Crown. Please help me welcome Pamela Paul, who is here with us tonight to celebrate Rectangle Time.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. I only wish it were in person.
So Pamela, would you like to speak for a little bit about your inspiration and then read the book, or do you want to do the in reverse order? What would you like?
Maybe I'll read the book and then I can talk a little bit about it, my inspiration, since nobody here has really seen it other than probably you and me.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share a screen so that y'all can see this beautiful book that Pamela created while she reads to you.
All right, so I'm just going to start. This is the cover. This is the cover as it appears digitally. Obviously, there's the back cover. And then as we go in, this is actually something that was a delight and a surprise to me. My illustrator, Becky Cameron, who is in the UK and who I have never actually met, and I can talk about how that works a little bit later on. She just did this on her own, and it's very clear that she too is a cat owner and lover. I don't know if owner is even the right word. Maybe it's a housemate to a cat, to 2 cats. So she created these end papers. And here's the title page. And we both dedicated the book to cats in our lives. My dedication was to Zoomer and in memory of Johnny, who was his stepbrother. I can't say they always got along, but Zoomer was certainly the direct inspiration of this book.
Sweet.
All right, I'm going to read. Oh, good. It's time. They're bringing out the rectangle. I know just what they need. A soft, fluffy, non-rectangular shape to offset those sharp corners and round out the company. You can always count on me for rectangle time. Be there in a jiff. Boy, man, rectangle, and me. All the necessary pieces are in place. Here's what I've discovered. Rectangle time usually takes place at night, though sometimes they break out the rectangle during the day too. The man does a lot of talking, but it's a low-key activity overall. Just the right setting for a furry nuzzle. Watch carefully. See how the man and the boy hold the rectangle together? That means they each have one hand free for me. You can tell how much they need me. Sometimes I scratch an itch on the corner of the rectangle. This is how I help make the rectangle feel useful too. Other times, I rub my signature scent on the rectangle's edges. This is a form of generosity on my part. We all share in our own ways. Great, it's that time of day again. Hello, rectangle. Wait a second, this is new. The boy and the man are taking turns holding the rectangle now. That's okay. I'll let who's ever not holding it stroke my belly. Some cats get prickly about the belly rub, not me. The boy and the man are taking turns talking too? It's nice to have two voices in the mix, but three would be even better. You know, background music. Rectangle time. Something has seriously shifted. What happened to the man? Why is the boy holding the rectangle all by himself? I better go in. Look at the poor little guy. He's just staring at the rectangle, alone, quiet, too quiet. Clearly, he needs me now more than ever. Meow. That should break up the silence. It feels so good to be helpful. Phew, he still knows what to do with my chin area. I got worried. Yes, that's the spot right there. A bit more to the left, please. To the left. Yow! No big deal. It wasn't on purpose. I get it. That rectangle is awfully small. No wonder he has to stare at it so hard. I must be outside his field of vision. I'll just let him know I'm ready. We all need little reminders sometimes. Wait, what? I'm going to assume that was an accident. Ahoy! There's that undersized rectangle again. I'll make things right this time. Sorry to keep you waiting. Sweet, fluffy, and very much cuddly object at your service. He seems seriously distracted. I'll move a little closer since it's just the two of us these days. I will enhance your rectangle. Ah, there we go. Now that was not an accident. I must be positioning myself wrong. Maybe softly shaped objects don't belong on top of rectangles after all. Maybe they belong on top of other irregularly shaped fluffy objects. There, that's better. We can still call it rectangle time.
So sweet. Oh my God.
And there are the end papers again.
Yeah, so good.
Yes, you can. I love it because in the early end papers, the child is young, and you sort of see him as a baby, and the kitten is a baby, and then here he's aging, and the cat is accommodating himself to his boy.
Yeah, it's just so sweet. Oh my goodness. Okay, and your cat sounds were really impressive, especially the purring.
I'm familiar with that animal.
No, but not everybody can purr like that. So inspiration, please. How long did you think about doing this? Did you think about, you have 3 children, so tell us when desire to write a children's book and how the one for this started. And I just want to jump in and say, this is, that you bring in the transitioning from, obviously, from being read to what that's about on its own for a child that no other book does actually at all.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I had to.
I'd love to hear the whole Megillah of all of that, if you don't mind, Pamela.
Oh yeah. So I have wanted to write a picture book for a really long time. I don't know, even really before I joined the New York Times as a children's books editor, but especially once I came to the Times, because what you do in that job is you're looking at all of these amazing picture books, and there are so many great picture books, but I don't think you can help over time, or at least I couldn't help over time thinking like, well, why isn't there one about this? And what I really would like is one that does this. And so I kept these ideas in my head and actually talked about them with my kids. And they were very enthusiastic about this. And I had, like several working titles. Rectangle Time actually wasn't one of them, but every time I would say I was writing a new book, my kids would be like, oh, good, it's going to be the tallest building in the world, or elevator versus escalator. Finally, you're going to write it. And I would be like, no, it's another grown-ups book. And so they were, disappointed each time that I was doing this other, foolish, distracting project on the side. And this book actually came right in the moment to me. My youngest and I will sit in his room, and every time we take out a book and I start reading it aloud, one of our cats, Zoomer, will come in and basically do everything that the cat narrator does in this book. Like he will, essentially, what's interesting about it is that I can be talking to my youngest son and he won't come in. I can be playing a game with my youngest son and he won't come in. But there's something about the tone or the act of telling a story that the cat just assumes, like, now it is my time. And if the door is closed, he will scratch at the door until we open it and let him in. And so in the middle of this one time, I said, you know what? And we called it Rectangle Time, amongst ourselves. And I just thought, you know what, this has to be a book. And I just got up and my son followed me, and I went and I immediately started writing it. And he had little input on his own about various parts. And it just came to me like that. It felt like a book a story that I don't know, I was inspired, but there were a few underlying things to this book that were really important to me that fit into that category of things that I hadn't seen often enough or wanted more. One of those was that, in working on How to Raise a Reader, I was very involved also as children's books editor and earlier in my career at Scholastic, the children's books publisher where I worked in the 90s. Involved in the issue around boys and reading, and the fact that statistics do show that boys read less frequently than girls, and they read less frequently for fun, and they're less likely to cite reading as a favorite activity. And there are some interesting statistics that go alongside that, which is that both boys and girls say that they see their fathers reading less to them than their mothers, and they see their fathers reading less on their own. And parents of both, men and women say that men are less likely to read to their children. So I think that modeling is a large part of it. I think any parent knows that modeling certain activities has a huge influence on children. So I wanted to have a book about reading that was about boys, but also about boys and fathers. And I also felt that in picture books, you very rarely see a boy and a father together in a kind of quiet and intimate domestic setting. You might see it like in a sports context or in a kind of problematic oppositional way. And I wanted to show a book in which, the parents and the children aren't in opposition. That's one of the things that, if you're familiar with the Japanese filmmaker Miyazaki, that one of the great things about his films is that it's interesting that the parents and the children in his films aren't sort of set against one another the way they are in so many animated American children's movies. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to have a story in which there wasn't any kind of friction between the parent and the child. So that was another part of it. A third part of it was that the cat in this book really is a narcissist, as all cats are, but he's really a stand-in for children, and frankly for all of us, right? Like we all think when we enter a room or we you know, or get into some kind of situation that it's about us. You know, you can walk into a meeting room in the office and there may have been many things going on in there before you got there, but when you go in, you think it's about us. And I think especially children, obviously, the world revolves around them. And so the cat is kind of the stand-in for the child.
Absolutely.
And so at a deeper level for me,
that the cat
the book is
the cat has to adjust. He has a more difficult time adjusting to the boy's changed reading than the boy, which is so beautiful that you let the cat have the problems.
Yes.
So that the child could just go, oh, it's going to be an easy transition. And the cat is just having trouble, but I'm going to sail through fine. Like that was so beautiful. But sorry, keep going. Yeah.
And I think that there's, you know, kids love to sort of feel like they are seeing things maybe that characters in the book aren't seeing, right? So there are two interesting things that happen in children's books. One is that kids generally like to read about kids that are older than themselves, but there are interesting exceptions. And one of the most probably well-known exception are Beverly Cleary's Ramona books, right? Because Ramona is a kindergartner, but mostly those books are read by kids who are in first, second, third grade. So they're older than Ramona. And what they can do, what they like about Ramona is that they can look at her and think like, I used to be like that, but now I know better, right? And so that's another thing that kids like in a picture book. They like the fact that they can kind of see that the cat is being really silly and ridiculous and doesn't get it, but that the reader, the child, gets it. So the child is like a step above the reader, but I think probably also recognizes in the cat maybe something of their own. So the other deeper story that I wanted to tell has to do with social cues, right? And again, this is something that everyone gets wrong. Kids get it wrong, but grownups get it wrong all the time too. Probably now more than ever that we're all on Zoom and we're not able to kind of read the room. And so the cat is constantly misreading social cues, right? From the very moment he walks in, he thinks that, you know, the book is there for him to help, to enhance, and that he's helping the boy. And he really, of course, you know, is doing nothing of the kind. And so it's looking at a way in which we all can misread social cues, but that hopefully we can all kind of come to a common understanding and accommodation of one another.
Oh, that's so beautiful. That is just so beautiful. I love how you wove all that in. I did obviously love that you had it the father instead of the mother. And I love that you let all of the anxiety of the change happen to the cat. And then the boy is able to have master of that and be fine and watch the cat. But I love that you brought in the aspect of the social cues, which is so relevant now, and that we're able to talk about in a way that we couldn't, you know, I think even 5 or 10 years ago. So your children's reaction to it, were they your first readers? Did they give you notes? You want to give us a little peek into that editorial process?
Yeah, no, they were my first readers and my first editors. I have a wonderful editor at Philomel, and she did an amazing job. But my kids were my early readers and editors. And my youngest, in fact, did change the sort of italics in one sentence in particular. And he had lots of suggestions that I overrode, which happens all the time in a writer-editor relationship. Yeah. It's called the writer pushing back against the editor. And editors, I think, as writers are probably the worst at doing that, you know. It's a little bit like the pedestrian driver relationship, like whichever one you're in, you know, you see the other as being totally violating all the rules and going about it the wrong way. It's a little bit like that when you're a writer and an editor. So in my writer position, my kids, they did offer edits and feedback, and especially when it got to the illustration phase, because, and I'll explain a little bit for those of you who don't know how picture books work, how the relationship works between an author and an illustrator. So there are the gods who walk the earth, who are both authors and illustrators, the Maurice Sendaks, the Dr. Seuss's, Christian Robinson, Mel Williams. These are people who write and illustrate their books, and John Klassen, who did I Want My Hat Back. With them, they're doing both processes at the same time. So they're really creating these two stories that are told simultaneously, the visual story and the text story together. And so it's always perfection when it comes in, or after it's been through an edit. With an author who is not an illustrator, and I am very much not an illustrator, I can tell you that people would have to be paid to look at a book that I illustrated. I can't even do stick figures. But with a writer who's not an illustrator, one of the things that the editor does is find the illustrator together with their art team. They choose the illustrator, and when you submit a picture book, you submit it not as a sort of page by page text, but really as a block of text in which the text alone, the words alone, have to kind of convey the story so that it could be read just by words. And the illustrator then will take that and they will determine what's going to be on each page. That's not the author's job. And I assume that the editor and the team at the publishing house are working with the illustrator as they go along. And eventually I get, as the author, sketches that show what the book looks like. So I then went through a process where I would get the sketches and I would show them to my kids too. They had input here. I also had a little bit of say, and they would say, "Oh, that cuddly, that cat on his back looks a little stiff," or have little remarks about details in the illustration. And it was really wonderful working. I want to say together with Becky, although I've never met her and I've never spoken to her, but I felt like there was a kind of there was a relationship between us in which the editor of the book, Liza Kaplan, was kind of like the diplomat, the emissary between us. And so I could offer notes, and then she came back with, another set of illustrations until we got to the final. And that was a really interesting process for me. One of the things that I love the most in my work at the New York Times is with the book review is working together with the art director on the covers for the book review. And that process of matching image to text is one I really love, and obviously was able to do a lot more in a picture book.
Do you feel like she brought out an area of the story that surprised you, or what was there a point in the process that you felt like, oh, this did bring out? I'd love for you to talk about that.
Well, it was clear that she understood cats. And I think that was really important because so much of what I think the story is showing is the real behavior and expressions of a cat. And, that's not easy or natural. Certainly it's not natural to a non-illustrator. But, I don't know that all illustrators necessarily pick up on the nuances of how a cat kind of moves and what its face looks like and how it washes its paw and how it might look offended or irritated. So I thought that her understanding of this animal really came through. One of the other things about picture books that I think is so fascinating about the form is that it really each book tells two stories at once. So the adult, when they're reading the book aloud before a child is able to read the book on her own, they're reading the text, but the child is reading the pictures. Mm-hmm. So they're reading one story while you're reading another. They're getting both. But I think any parent who has read aloud a picture book to a child has had the experience of the child having a reaction to something in the pictures that, especially if it's your first time reading the book and you haven't looked at the pictures, might surprise you. Like you might be sitting there reading the text and thinking like, this is very serious and I'm doing this funny elephant voice. And then your kid, will laugh or be like, oh, and it's because they're seeing something on the page. It's this kind of parallel story that, at its best always enhances the pictures, the text, but really goes beyond that in the best picture books, which is that they add another layer. They're telling another story at the same time. And so that the child, as you are reading aloud the text, and they may eventually pick up on letter recognition, or they might start remembering some of the words and have word recognition, they're reading in another way. They're reading the pictures. They're doing that kind of sequential thinking that's part of the process of eventually learning how to read. And, anyone who has a child who has learned to read and you've sort of seen what they do in classrooms, it often starts with like a sequencing of pictures. And it's children being asked to do things in preschool where they're given 3 pictures and they need to put them in the right order. That's part of learning how to read.
All right. That's beautiful. I love that. And you really, in this book, really brings us into that world that the child is so surrounded in, and the intimacy of that you get with the book, and then with the parent, and then the cat. I love the outer layers, and then how it comes in. Some people are asking questions, which is wonderful, and giving comments. And if you have any, please put them in the chat. One woman said, an amazing book, which is true. Is the cat in the book a calico? I used to have a calico cat. So Pamela, will you answer that?
Yeah, the cat is a calico. And that was another surprise, because Becky has a tuxedo cat and I have a tuxedo cat. That's the black and white cat. So it was interesting that she chose a calico cat. Another funny thing that I find fascinating and really kind of beautiful is that in different reviews of this book that have come out, the sort of early reviews, some people have very decisively characterized the cat as a male cat and others as a female cat. And I kind of love that, people can read into this cat what they see. I think it's probably telling about the reviewer or something, how they chose to see the gender of the cat. And, that's another thing. While I was very specific about the gender of the boy and the father, one of the great things about animals in picture books is that by and large, they are totally gender neutral. And so they enable anyone, whatever their gender identity, to kind of see themselves in that character. And that's one of the reasons why animal stories are so popular in picture books, because, that's a way that anyone can see themselves reflected in the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially the sweet little cat. I love that cat. He's so sweet. All right. Someone else said the book has a very Shanahan, the New Yorker cartoonist, illustration feel to it. I love it. And did you get to pick the illustrator? Were you submitted different sketches of one so that you were able to pick Becky, or did your editor just decide? And how was that process for you?
So, I'm probably, I don't know if it's a nightmare or if it's like a benefit, but my editor could answer that better. But I definitely came with opinions about illustrators, because I love picture books and I read them all the time. And I have illustrators who I absolutely adore. And I love New Yorker cartoonists, and there are a number of New Yorker cartoonists like Harry Bliss and Bruce R. Kaplan, and Harry Bliss, who, did I just say Harry Bliss? I think I said him twice, but there are a number of them who do picture books. And so I came with a list of illustrators I really loved, and Becky Cameron was totally unknown to me. And they came back with her after a kind of process of conversation, and I was delighted. So that's how we landed on her.
Yeah, it's completely beautiful. So are your kids now rallying for you to write some of the other books? Are you thinking about that after your next adult book, or?
Oh yeah.
The elevator escalator one sounds great. I only know that, and I'm loving that book already. So
I have many ideas. I have to say the process of writing this book is so different from writing an adult book. And I also poetry is my appreciation of poetry probably stopped at the Shel Silverstein phase. So I don't know what it's like to edit poetry, but I imagine that there's some kind of analogy here, and that you're dealing with a finite amount of words, and there's such a precision in choosing the right words that the editing, on a word by word, line by line basis is much more intense than it is when you're working with a book that's, 50,000 or 100,000 words, which is what, your typical adult book is like. This is, more like between 500 and 1,000 words, but each word, has to be so right. So there was a lot of back and forth about like, well, is prickly the right word, or is defensive the right word? The belly rubbing. And that's another interesting thing about picture books to me is the language. I find it really challenging and fascinating to figure out what the right amount of sophistication is in a picture book. I think, that there is an age at which children see every new word as equally mysterious. So you could say, pretty, or you could say dazzling. And both of those, even though we think pretty is the, simpler word, and exquisite or dazzling is more complicated, like for a child, those are both mysteriously unknown. And there's a period up to which children absorb language just sort of all at once without questioning it. That's just when they're learning to acquire language. And then they get to a certain age, and every parent or caregiver, I'm sure, has recognized this, or teacher, where they then start to ask, what does that word mean? What does that word mean? Now, of course, you realize once they start asking, well, wow, you never asked that before, because all words were new. So they do get to a point where they're asking that question. And with picture books, most of them are kind of in that magical before time where they're not asking. Mm-hmm. So you'll notice with picture books, again, also because the adult is reading and not the child, that the language is more sophisticated than it is in an early chapter book where the child is having to decode and read the words themselves. So it gives you a little bit more liberty, but you still have to kind of work within a framework of what will be generally accessible, because you want to try to reach, the broadest range of people possible. And you also have to recognize that the people who are reading aloud, English might not be their first language, so you don't want to make it too difficult for them either. So it's kind of finding that right balance of language.
That's beautiful. We have a bunch of questions, and I do want to get back to your writing your next adult book and how this changed that. So let's remember that, but I don't want to ignore all of these wonderful comments. This is from Sue Mermelstein. I'd always assumed that the author and illustrator collaborated together without the editor serving as a middleman. Is it standard procedure in children's book publishing to keep some distance between the two? And if so, why? And then I have another one after that from somebody.
It's interesting. I did not know that this was the way most picture books worked until I was the children's books editor and began talking about the process with editors. So I'm not sure how it evolved. There are instances, however, where there are illustrators and writers who will collaborate together. So, for example, Matt de la Pena and Christian Robinson, who won a Newbery Newbery Medal for their book Last Stop on Market Street, and they have a new book coming out this season. They work together, and there are writers like Lemony Snicket has worked together with John Klassen. Matt Barnett, who writes a lot of really great picture books, often works with the same sort of rotating group of illustrators. There are definitely people who have or Adam Rubin and Daniel Salmieri. They do these great books that I love mostly around pigeons, but people probably know them from what was it? Taco Pizza? I'm forgetting. Probably there are lots of people who in the room were like, of course it's Taco Pizza Party. I can't remember, but they worked closely together. So there are definitely exceptions to the rule, but as a first-time writer, this was the way it worked for me.
Well, and worked out beautifully because she was fabulous and she caught such a beautiful essence of the kitty cat. Okay, so from Michael to everyone, but it might not be Michael. As a mom, I love reading books to my 6-year-old son at night. However, my son loves hearing made-up stories from dad at night as opposed to reading books together. How can I encourage them to read together more versus telling made-up stories together, which is also beautiful in its own way, but I'd love them to read together more. I loved your book, How to Raise a Reader, which I'm going to hold up because no home is complete without this. Okay, Pamela, would you address that wonderful question?
It's a great question. And I love the fact that your husband is doing this with your child. I don't know that it's a zero-sum game. I feel very open to all forms of storytelling. What your husband is doing is it's like he's the audiobook, and audiobooks can actually be really great for a lot of kids. I think there are certain advantages to listening to stories in that, you have to pay a certain kind of attention. It requires a kind of different part of your brain. And I think it's really challenging for some people to not lose focus, when they're listening to a book aloud. And I love the fact that he's making them up. So I don't think, that it's hard for me to say anything that would discourage that, but I would imagine, particularly, with your child, that at some point he'll be wanting to read on his own. And I think that the reading aloud probably is just as much of a carrot as having a book read aloud to him, because it's showing the power of storytelling. And eventually what happens with kids is they want that power, themselves. So as long as they're appreciating stories in some way, then at a certain point, they're going to want to own that, on their own. So I don't know. I think it's not bad. I think I would enjoy it. And as we all know, kids change so quickly. So this phase might go away and then you might miss it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And there was a wonderful study that showed that hearing books, children get the same vocabulary advantages as they do from reading. So
yeah. Another point I just want to say about audiobooks, as long as we're talking about it, is that they're a really wonderful way for kids who have dyslexia or any other kind of reading challenge to learn to appreciate stories and to get a more sophisticated kind of story than they might be able to read on their own. And so it's really powerful in that way. And the other thing that's really great about stories aloud in an audiobook form is that there are certain really terrific universal kind of stories that kids across different age ranges can hear and appreciate and enjoy. So if you have multiple children of different ages, and you're in like a long car trip, for example, there are some stories like, The One and Only Ivan by Catherine Applegate, or E.B. White's Charlotte's Web, or, Greek myths, where you listen to them aloud and everyone in the car, whether they're 5 years old or 8 years old or 12 years old can kind of absorb it and enjoy it in their own way. So that's another really beautiful thing I think about audio format.
Yeah, that is amazing. What a gift that is to children. Give them that mastery of story without the frustration of looking at the written word with language-based learning disabilities. Okay, I'm reading a question. I was read to by my mother and father, and also by a friend of my mom and dad's friend who is a librarian. It had a wonderful impact on my early childhood years. I think this is a great way to show the power of reading and to be able to show kids that reading is fun in a book form. It's great PR for the formative years. Well, that was lovely. So not really a question there, but I had been, this from another attendee, I had been under the impression that this program was going to partially focus on how to raise a reader, as the illustrator of that book cover was shown with the program. Can we spend some time on that? Okay. Sorry, Joe.
I can say a few things. I can say a few things about that in response to both of the last comments that you made. One of the most important and well-known facts about raising a reader is that reading aloud to children is incredibly important. One of the lesser known facts is that if you look at what factors lead to someone becoming a lifelong reader, just as important as being read aloud to on a regular basis is having a large number of books in the home. So you can kind of see like behind me. Obviously I have an advantage in that I get a lot of books for free at work, but I'm really glad that we're doing this as a library event, because libraries are a really great resource for families who don't necessarily have the means to go out and buy a lot of brand new books. That statistic, I want to say, is that is controlling for income and education level. So it's not just that the most well-off, well-educated families have a lot of books in their home and therefore the kids become lifelong readers. That's controlling for those factors. And so even if you don't have a lot of money and you go to the library or you go to a library sale and you have a constantly rotating stream of books in your house, that is an extremely important part of raising a reader. And that's because when you think about it, it makes sense. It's about access. It's about options. To my mind, you really cannot have a child say they're bored if they're surrounded by books. And so I think that it's also really important to have books in certain places. So one place it's important to have is in the child's room. And if the child's in a shared room, to make sure that each child has, their own bookshelf or their own shelf on a bookcase that's their books, because children really do love to own their books. They like to, possess things and have things that they consider belong to them. And I think once kids become readers, those stories really do belong to them. But I think it's also important to have books throughout the house. So in the room where you have a TV, in the room where you have computers, in the room where your kids do their homework, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, having cookbooks, having books about food, having kids' cookbooks, just to always have that option so that if a kid is sitting there saying they're bored, there's an obvious source of entertainment that isn't on a screen and that doesn't necessarily require another person for them to turn to.
That's great. And with this book, there are so many other things in here, pointers that Pamela has at different stages of the child's life. So How to Raise a Reader, jumping in at any age, right? Pamela, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, and I welcome, if you want to put specific questions about raising readers into the chat, I'm happy to answer any questions about that, because obviously that I feel a bit evangelical on this point.
Right. And it's not just that, it only works if you start at 2. I mean, you're very clear about starting the kid at 12, 14.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the book is about, from babyhood, really, frankly, from before the child is born up through adolescence, because it really is never too late to become a reader. And one of the interesting things that I learned when I was editing By the Book, which is the column in the book review each week in which we ask someone about their reading life, a lot of really celebrated literary writers did not become readers really until they were teenagers. And I also want to emphasize something an earlier commenter said about fun. The fun part is so important. And that sounds, very sort of superficial, but it's quite deep, because children have a lot of choice about the way in which they spend their leisure time. And, at all ages, they have many, many things at their disposal. It is so much more fun to be a kid now in certain ways, not during quarantine, I'm afraid, but in general, in our era, than it was like in the 70s when, there were no video games, there was no internet, there were 4 bad channels, on TV that showed Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch and the Lone Ranger every day after school. And you just didn't have the range of entertainment that you do. And kids had far fewer extracurricular activities. So you had a lot of empty time. Now we kind of have the problem of kids have a ton of activities. They have lots of homework. They have all kinds of obligations, and they have this huge array of ways in which to entertain themselves. So if they have very little time for leisure and lots of choices, you want them to read, then you're never going to raise readers if reading becomes something obligatory, something difficult, something frustrating, something hard, something not pleasurable. So a few specific tips I would give. One is, you as a parent, you as a caregiver or a grandparent, never want to be in the position of trying to teach your children how to read. I think that those parents among you who have been involved in remote schooling know just how hard it can be to teach children how to read if you have to be in, if your child is at that stage. In general, that's the school's responsibility. And as a parent, what your job is to teach children how to love to read. You're showing them, you're trying to dangle that carrot, not that stick. And they feel under enough pressure to learn how to read from not just school, but from the environment, that they are in, generally speaking. And so what they need from you is access to the love and encouragement of the love. And so one other specific tip I would say is, if you're worried about what they're reading, don't. Because as long as they're reading, and it gets to the point of the person whose husband is reading aloud, as long as they're appreciating storytelling, as long as they're reading in some form, be happy, because they're reading and associating that with pleasure. So one of the nerve-wracking things that parents come and ask me at readings, or when I was the children's books editor, is, my child is only reading comics, they're only reading graphic novels, they're not reading real books. And I want to emphasize, those are real books. Those are picture books for older kids. And if your child is enjoying them, the last thing you want to do is say oh, that's not good. Right. That's not a real book. And to penalize them for that, not only is there a lot of genius in those books and much to be appreciated, but also they're enjoying it. So why deny them that pleasure? And, the child who is reading Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts and Dog Man and Cat Kid and all of these books, Wimpy Kid, and enjoying them, they might not have been reading if those books hadn't been the gateway. And eventually what happens is they will run out of those books. For better or for worse, there aren't that many. As you will know, if you have graphic novel and comics books loving kids, which all 3 of my kids are, they will run out and they will look for other things. They will move on. And if they go back to those books when a new one comes out, that's okay too, because kids are just like grownups in that sometimes you want to read Dostoevsky, and other times you want to read Tana French or, John Grisham. Like they are allowed to have relaxing, fun reads as well as challenging reads.
Yeah, that's beautiful. All right. So many wonderful, good questions also, because you're inspiring such great thoughts. You have compiled some amazing lists at the end of How to Raise a Reader. Have you considered making them available on your website and making additions to them as relevant new books come out?
I think it's definitely an open question that we might update the books. It's interesting. We haven't done them on the website. It is actually a lot of work, but we probably will update the book at some point. The book itself, How to Raise a Reader, started off as a digital guide to reading. And what we got in terms of overwhelming feedback, it was a digital guide that my then children's books editor, Marie Russo, and I created for the New York Times. The overwhelming response was, why isn't this a book? This needs to be a book. So we made it into a book. I don't know that we'll make it back into a website, but it could be another edition of the book in future.
That's fabulous. Okay. And can you address your reader comments a little to babies and 1-year-olds?
Sure. So a few ideas around reading to babies. One interesting thing is people often will feel very silly reading aloud to a baby, knowing that the baby isn't understanding anything that you're saying at all. But what they are hearing is your language, and they're getting used to the idea and the ritual of storytelling. And for a baby and for a toddler, reading is a full body experience. It's an all senses experience. If they're sitting in their lap, they're feeling your body, they're hearing your voice. If they're holding a board book, they're feeling the pages of that board book. As they get older, as they're toddlers, they learn to turn the pages of that board book. So it's about gross motor skills. It's a textual experience. There are many, many great board books now that are interactive, that have, things that pages that crinkle and things that you can fold. They are in control of the story once they're able to turn the books. And I think that's really important too, as children age, to let them set the pace. This gets back to the idea of the pictures are telling as much of a story as the text. And so when a grown-up is reading a story to a kid, your impulse is to turn as soon as you're done with the text. But you will find that, from toddler age, even from baby age, like they will show you with their hands that they want you to stay on that spread. They want to be on that page, that they're not done yet. And it's really important to allow them, really from a very early age, you can say to a child, sometimes even before they're speaking, like, do you want to turn the page now? You want to stay on this page? And they like to be in charge of their stories. So, and again, the other thing about reading to really young children is that it helps you as a new parent or a new caregiver to get used to reading stories aloud to kids, and you're learning how to do it yourself. I think when many of us have a brand new baby, it's just as awkward for us, as parents to be reading aloud. You feel like you're a kindergarten teacher or you're, the school librarian when you were in school, and it can feel awkward. And so it takes a little bit of time for you to grow into it as well. So it's a great time to become comfortable with reading aloud.
You also brought up a great point that I'd love for you to talk more about when you were talking about the child sometimes wants to really stay on a page, after you finish reading the words, which brings up that very common thing that children do where they want the same book every night, which is wonderful. And I'd love for you to talk about that and kind of the interesting what different books do at different stages of development for them and how they help the kid go through it.
So I have a lot to say about rereading books, and it is wonderful. It's also not wonderful as a parent if you hate the book. I think, let's be honest here, there are some picture books and board books that your child might get really into that you're like, oh my God, you go on autopilot, and it is hard to try to remember. You need to put your emotion into it. But the great ones like Goodnight Moon, those last forever because I still can read that book aloud. And I think if I say to any of you in the great green room, many of you can probably say there was a telephone, and a red balloon. We all know that story by heart. And that's what the baby is hearing, or the toddler. They're hearing the same story over and over again. That repetition is not just comforting, it is also educational because they are learning to memorize that story. And again, for those who are parents who know the feeling of like you go out and you're in a waiting room at the doctor's office, or you're standing in line at the grocery store, and your kids, they're bored or they're antsy or they're just like, they're needing something. There's a temptation now to just hand them the phone. If you carry a few of those board books that your baby, that your toddler, your young child has memorized, even if they can't read technically, they can read those books to themselves because they know them by heart. And that's exciting for them too, and empowering, because they can read them on their own. That's the way they think about it. And why shouldn't they? Because they are reading it in their own way. And so for children, that's how they also begin to recognize the letters, the words, the way in which the story, goes. And it's funny, I think all of you can probably have had experiences where you're reading aloud to the children, maybe you skip a page and your child will say like, you missed a page, you're reading, brown bear, and they recognize that you have passed an animal because they know that book probably better than you. And again, like it's hard to do this sometimes as a parent, especially at the end of the day, if you're exhausted and you're, it's the end of your workday and you feel like you're on autopilot, but doing that, having that repetition is so important. And I would say that repetition really goes all the way up through childhood into adolescence. So a lot of parents will get worried when the kid gets into the Harry Potter phase or whatever the equivalent is, the Rick Riordan phase, and they are just with the Warriors books phase. If anyone is like, has their kid has gotten into the Cat Warrior books phase, that like they're just reading the same book over and over again. They're stuck, they're in a rut, they're not moving on, they're not moving up. But you have to remember that like these are comfort. This is comfort food for them. This is comforting. And for kids, the worlds in these books are worlds they want to be in. And who wouldn't want to be in Hogwarts sometimes, maybe more than in the real world. And for kids too, and for teenagers, the characters are like friends, this is a familiar cast. So kids really do like to reread. And the other thing I would point out is that, any adult who's done some rereading knows that if you read a book in your 20s and then you go back to it in your 40s, you often read it in a very different way, because you're at a different time in your life. And so you're seeing things, that you might not have seen when you were young. And the example I often think of is Anna Karenina, where if you're in your 20s, you think like, this is so romantic. And then if you're newly married, you might think like, I cannot believe that she is cheating, with Vronsky and abandoning her child. But then if you read it, again, in your 50s or your 60s, you might think like, oh, this is, understandable. And you've sort of been around. And so for kids, when they're changing, like not just every year, but month to month, the reading experience they have of the same book after a few months is going to be radically different from the last time they read it, because they're different. They're seeing different things in that book. And with really good books too, they're beginning to appreciate the storytelling, the way in which, the story is told. I want to tell one story that gets back to that idea of graphic novels. So there's a book series called Bad Kitty by Nick Bruhl. It's a really great series of books. It's kind of in the wimpy kids mode. It's not quite a graphic novel, but it's a little bit like that. And again, you can look at it and be like, those books look dumb or silly, and they are not. They're really, really brilliant. And there's one book where the child, where he's talking about storytelling, and he breaks down the elements of a story. And I hadn't read that particular one. My youngest child read it on his own, but I used to have this ritual with him where at night when I would tuck him in, I would tell him a short story in the form of putting a dream into his ear. So I would sort of give him like a story starter and put it into his ear before he went to bed. And, it's the end of the day when I'm doing this. I'm often exhausted. I'm very ready for him to be in bed. So I'd often rush through, and these dreams were not like my best work, shall we say. And at one point, I went through my little dream story, I put it in his ear, and he turned and he said, "That's it? That's a terrible story. There's no conflict." And it turns out that he had learned that conflict was an essential part of the story from Bad Kitty. And he was right.
Oh, that's so sweet. You should tell Nick that. He would love that. There are questions. Who are some of the authors that inspire you, Pamela, if you want to answer?
Oh, I mean, children's book authors or adult authors?
They don't say so.
I'm going to talk about a children's book since we're on that subject. I really am amazed by the genius of, we'll talk about one old writer no longer with us and one contemporary. The one that contemporary I was going to say is Mel Williams, I think is a real genius. I think that the Knuffle Bunny trilogy is like a work of great art. If you're not familiar with it, even if you don't have kids, just go out, and it's 3 picture books. They're about lovies. They tell the story of growing up. They tell the story of needing something, and the story of letting go, and the story of giving something away in the form of stories. I cry and I get chills just talking about it. It's very upsetting. I love those books so much. And he also does the Elephant and Piggy early readers, which I highly recommend for early readers. There are just 2 characters, Elephant and Piggy. And one of the great things you can do is you can decide with your reader, especially if they're reluctant to read and they're reluctant to read aloud and they're nervous, how about you be Elephant and I be Piggy, or they choose. And then you're each taking turns. And so they get so into it and they can act it out that they're reading despite themselves on their own. So I think he's really great. And then someone who's no longer with us, who I really admire, is William Steig, who's written some of the great picture books of all time, Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, Brave Irene, The Amazing Bone, which may be my favorite, Caleb and Kate. One of the things that I love about William Steig, who wrote Rotten Island, wrote and illustrated his own books, is that he broke a lot of the rules, or the rules as we consider them today. One of them, which didn't used to be a rule, but it now is, which is that, text generally corresponds to the page, the art in the page, but often it would flow. So the most famous example of that is The Little Engine That Could, the Wally Piper. You'll note when you're reading it, the text goes, through the pages. It doesn't just stop on each page. And so the pictures don't totally correspond with the text. And so William Steig would do that. He broke another rule of picture books, which is that by and large, and there are exceptions, most picture books have a child in them, or an animal who's a stand-in for a child. And what William Steig did in Caleb and Kate is it's a story about an old married couple that gets into a terrible fight. And Caleb storms off, leaving Kate alone in the house, and he meets a witch, and he's transformed into a dog. And then he comes back in the form of the dog to be with his wife. And in the course of this, both of them regret the things they said, and they desperately, miss each other. And Kate doesn't realize that the dog is actually Caleb. But one of the great things about it is there's no children whatsoever in the story, because Caleb and Kate are the kids, really, like they're behaving very childlike with their big fight. So he did things like that, and he used generally more sophisticated stories more sophisticated language than a lot of picture books do. I think he showed a great respect for his reader. He kept the bar high, and I think that in general, I'm a fan of doing that. I think that kids are capable of so much more sometimes than we give them credit for. That they often see things in stories that we don't see. And so I love that William Steig I think he wrote for the way that he saw children, which is, just capable of much more.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful note to end on. And, considering how Common Core is phasing so much fiction out, it's so important that this is encouraged. If there was one thing that you could say to parents and children about reading, what would that be? Or what would you want to
Oh, wow. So open-ended. I would say to remember that books and reading are it's not the broccoli, right? It's the reward. So they're the brownie, they're the dessert. And I think sometimes because we know how important reading is, that we know the correlation to educational achievement, to brain development, to social and emotional function. And we have all that research, and we know how important it is to school achievement, that we tend to freight it with so much heaviness and worry and stress and fear. And we forget that this is the joy, that stories are the joy. Like, you are, in teaching your children to love to read, you are opening up this world to them. So it's like you're taking them to like the Disneyland of leisure every day that you open up a book, every day that you show that appreciation. And so I think cultivating that sense of love and access and privilege to reading books, that like, this is something you get to do. Mm-hmm. It's not something you have to do.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that, Pamela. That was the perfect thing to say to everybody. And it's so happening in her new book, Rectangle Time. You can feel that love of the story between the little boy and the sweet cat and their growth in that. Thank you so much, Pamela, for coming here tonight with it. The book doesn't come out till February 16th. It was so sweet of her to be here. But what you can do is you can put a hold on it in your local library for when it comes in, because they do that. You can pre-order it in many, many bookstores. And you can give it to every child you know this year, which is what I'm going to do. So thank you so much for being here. Please, everybody, help me thank Pamela for a beautiful, beautiful evening. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you, and thank you to the Westchester Libraries, because we use you all the time, especially with the interlibrary loan. I think we've gotten books from all over Westchester. So thank you to being a resource for me and my family. And thank you to Lonnie and Dan for organizing this.
Absolutely. And Giovanna from Westchester Library Association is going to take us out and thank everyone also. Giovanna.
Yes, I am here. So I wanted to thank Pamela Paul and Delane for tonight's program. On behalf of the Westchester Library Association, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure collaborating with book YaYa and the Westchester Library System on the Library Author Talk series. We hope the series will inspire you to explore new authors and to discuss these wonderful books with friends and colleagues. Tonight's program was the launch event, and we'll look forward to future author talks. In the meantime, please stay connected, stay safe, and keep reading. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.